Welcome, everybody. Very excited to have a delightful and robust discussion with you. There's going to be some constructive and polite disagreement here, along with some gentle agreement. Really looking forward to our panelists. We have a quality team here. Before I introduce them and get started, a couple things. I think most of you have been at other events and are on the platform, so great. If not, on the right, you'll see a tab with chat, Q&A, polls. So for your questions, if you would put them in the Q&A part, I'm gonna do my best to take the questions throughout the discussion so that your questions are oxygenating our conversation. Please make sure to put them in the Q&A. And we'll make sure to wrap up here on time. And lastly, I want to thank our sponsor, Keyfactor, who does some pretty great work in device digital identity and PKI solutions and certificate issuance. And because without them, this session wouldn't be possible. So thank you again. So let's get started. Let me introduce my pretty fantastic panelists here. We have Ray from Keyfactor, Darren from Blackfog, Catherine from Fluence, and Vivek from Phrenos. So hi, everybody. Your cameras are all working okay. Your audio is all working okay. I've got the gremlins today, no problem. Let's start with a pretty big question, but a one that I think has been on a lot of people's minds and definitely in a lot of conversations. In what ways has the increasing complexity of supply chains reshaped our approach to protecting critical energy infrastructure?
Let me get started. Maybe
Vivek,
jump in. Yeah. So interestingly, supply chain has been a topic of a lot of conversations of late. Not that supply chain was not risky in the past, but I think post-COVID, a lot of these interdependencies have come out. A lot more people are aware of where the components are sourced. And of course, in software, we've always been quite aware of some of the risks of, using unauthorized coding and of course, APTs involved in certain kinds of attacks in supply chain, thanks to solar events. So that said, I guess the big overview is that now people are more aware and therefore asking the key questions, right? Whether they are putting some language in the RFQ process or analyzing their top tier suppliers much further than they were doing before, or at least getting some level of monitoring in place for both upfront and post deployment. So overall, I think the good thing that came out of all these additional complexities is that awareness has increased from regulators to policymakers to management to leadership. Everybody's asking the question. So overall, I see this as a positive improvement in how we're handling supply chain risks.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. To add on to that, though, when you take a look at the existing ecosystem that we have, that ecosystem is built up of parts that are old. Those older parts really need to be updated. That's going to require a lot of resources and whatnot. So I think that while the supply chain attacks and making sure that you've got valid components that aren't knockoff components and all the other things that are starting to become very important in play, making sure your firmware updates are signed and all of these other things, we need to make sure that we understand that there have to be other tools in place. How do we protect the existing ecosystem as best as we can for devices that were built pre 9/11, pre security attacks?
So I'm hearing a balance here between reliability and replacement of old parts versus establishing trust in some of the newer parts, and also just the notion of trust, balancing reliability with trust. Catherine, anything you want to add there?
I would say that if you think about the word complexity and why is the supply chain becoming really complex, like Vivek said, it's not that supply chain is new or that we haven't considered supply chain security before. And as Ray said, we do have to address the legacy. But what's happening now is that instead of just focusing on your tier 1 suppliers, we're seeing the requirement, the need to go tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 deep to really look at what is the system within the system within the system and where could a vulnerability potentially be introduced that now we see can make huge financial implications on companies. And I think the Gartner did a study that said that by 2030, you might see impact up to $138 billion worldwide from just software supply chain attacks.
And that's just software.
Yeah.
Let's, Darren, I want to come to you next.
Mm-hmm.
So it's 2025, and in 2024, we used to say, are we going to talk about AI during this discussion? In 2025, the question is, are we not?
Right, exactly.
So the question I have for you, though, is talk to us about some unexpected ways that AI is being leveraged in attacks on energy infrastructure.
Yeah,
So,
well, good question.
Not the automation and the sort of accelerating scale kinds of things, but things that are really unique and different. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that it's definitely on the rise. I mean, we've seen unparalleled. Even January of this year has actually reached a new record in terms of attacks generally, but a lot of them are driven by AI these days. Unfortunately, with great technology, obviously the bad guys get access to it too. And we've seen now new ways of leveraging AI, not just the deep fakes, not just all of the stuff for acceleration that you talk about, but also actually using data exfiltration to take the data and then put all the data that they leverage into a big AI engine and actually use that to generate attacks. So not only are they threatening the organization from a ransomware perspective, but they're also training the data they stole to look at new ways to get people. So it's actually a multi-pronged process these days.
Yeah, so the data that's being extracted is being weaponized.
Exactly right. And if you think you're going to pay the ransom and get your data back, think again, because we've seen examples of 3-4 years down the track after the threat and the ransom was paid and they said they wouldn't release it. It's available on the dark web still. So you can go buy that information. You can go train it and make it even better. So this is the world we're living in, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah, the concept of data encryption at rest and in transit is so important inside of this conversation. You cannot be doing anything that is not encrypted.
Totally agree.
Vivek, anything from you on surprising ways?
Yeah, I think AI is a significant equalizer in this regard, because for years together, we knew a couple things, that most of the attacks originated from the IT side before getting into OT. And secondly, getting into OT still didn't mean end of the way, because there was some engineering effort involved in actually manipulating process and causing some impact. Now, those two kind of problems or difficulties go away with AI, because now with a lot of interconnectivity and data from OT, the machine learning models that the attackers could leverage would make direct OT attacks possible, and secondly, exploit much more than what they were in the past. So we'll see a lot more exploitation on the OT and even ingress directly from OT. So the theory of 99 that Mandiant, for example, historically has noticed about how many attacks come from the IT side to OT, we'll see a percentage improvement of attacks originating in OT and being exploited in OT much more than before because of AI.
Completely agree with that. I mean, there's so many examples of that happening already. There was a temperature sensor in Las Vegas in a casino. They were able to hack that and jump onto the IT network. And one of the reasons why is because they had centralized trust between the IT network and the OT network. So one of the key concepts that we talk about when we're engaging with people at different levels of this entire supply chain is making sure that you've segmented trust. Make sure that only the things that need to trust each other can trust each other.
Yeah, zero trust, great principle. Yeah.
100%.
So let me push your thinking a bit, and let's really try and focus on electric utilities in this next, because they are highly regulated, and a lot of the thinking around cybersecurity comes in response to and under the constraint of regulation. So if you weren't constrained by regulation and you could design the ideal proactive cybersecurity strategy for an electric utility, what would it look like?
Yeah, I'll take this one. Historically, electric utilities in the U.S. have had quite a bit of regulation, right? So post 2003, we've had a lot of regulations, the SIP standards. Most of them were very regimented, thou shall do this, right? So they were sequential, very specific things that you had to do for a certain level of protection. So for high, criticality, you have X number of things to do. For medium and low, you had far fewer. So if we were to build something from scratch without the constrictions, or constraints of the past, we still need to acknowledge that these SIP standards have done a lot of good, right? So, what I would do is to implement very similar approaches in standards, but with a focus on risk, as opposed to telling everybody what to do based on a certain megawatt level or a certain criticality that others outside in would expect. Let the end users decide on what is a risk-based investment that'll reduce risk for them, right? So the standards themselves have been well thought of and well put to use, not just in the US but globally, because they're good. So the one improvement that we can significantly make to them is to make them all risk-based, as opposed to very regimented, sequential, and action-based and task-based.
But wouldn't you consider that they would just be baselines anyway? I mean, I always think of regulations as a baseline, bare minimums that need to be done. I would think that you would, we always talk a lot about multi-layered approaches to everything in terms of cybersecurity. You can't just rely on one product. You have to rely on multiple things using multiple mechanisms of action. And that's how you stop the bad guys. So yeah, I agree, regulation. I do think risks is a really good point, but I think multi-layered approach is important to talk about.
As well as testing your security measures. How good are they?
Yeah.
So having red teams and blue teams and turning around and practicing these, I would add.
Let me push both of you for a second, Ray and Darren. Come back to if you could design the ideal strategy. So these are things you're talking about, that are additive. But what would be your first principle? So we have from Vivek risk-based, and I've heard you say, Vivek, before, and I really like it, about the regulations. We know they add value, but we don't know how much value they add. So they're valuable, but how valuable in reducing cyber risk, we don't really know, hence your orientation around risk. So Darren, Ray, and Catherine, what would be your first principle, the core North Star?
To me, number one is that each device, no matter how connected, needs its own identity. Just like each person has a set of fingerprints, each device needs its own set of fingerprints. We can't turn around and say that fingerprint needs to live long. It needs to be manageable. It needs to be able to be rotated, and frequency. I mean, ultimately, I'd love if it was an ephemeral identity where your whole ecosystem is made up of zero trust.
So if you were designing a strategy for an electric utility, the not just the first thing, but the large thing would all hinge around identities. Is that right?
That is correct. In my mind, it has to be unique.
I disagree a bit. So if you think about, regulation, best practices, those are all tactics in a way to address cybersecurity controls. But what you really need to go is down to the foundation, the very first principle of cybersecurity, which is to mitigate the impact of an incident. And there you can combine function and security together. Because if you're thinking about what are the impacts to the function of the system that I'm trying to provide, and you base your cybersecurity off of that, then you address both the risk, you address the compliance, but more importantly, your strategy is based on actually mitigating any impact to the function. So then you support business value as well.
That's a good point.
That's interesting, though, because you're thinking about, well, not thinking, but you're stating the systems level thinking, right, for the company, for the society. While I agree that impact analysis is crucial for mitigating some of the outcomes, I don't know if that's the first principle for security per se, though, because what are we trying to solve for? Are we solving for the company, or are we solving for the society? I'm not quite sure if the question covers both. So if the question is for the society,
when we're talking about operational technology and we're talking about ICS, there's a different level of consideration of consequence. And I think that's where one of the many ways it differentiates from IT cybersecurity is there's very likely not to be smoke or fire or explosions when it comes to a IT cybersecurity incident, whereas an OT cybersecurity incident, you're going to assume that there's going to be explosions. Safety is a real question. And so there can be, toxic waste spilled, explosions, life lost. So we are talking about a degree both for that organization, but then to the environment that can bring on a different level of consequence. That's very much the reason why I have framed it that way. And why, just to bring full circle, right? Electric utilities are regulated.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Stuxnet, just think of that as one particular example. It's the mere fact that you could have a nefarious actor inside of your trusted ecosystem. And that's, again, why I still think some kind of means to establish trust, no matter where you're at, whether it be a person, whether it be a device, whether it even be the transmission. We need to make sure that we have set up a system that is robust enough to know that people and things are what they are.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's use that to move to a conversation about how we can effectively communicate the value of cybersecurity and really the investments in cybersecurity to stakeholders that might not be technical, but are executives and are seasoned, without using fear. So to say that differently, how do we convince the people that aren't necessarily responsible for, but are investing in cybersecurity, that it's important without using fear? Or do we need to use a little bit of fear?
Well, it depends how you describe fear. I would argue that education is what we're all about. We want to make sure people are aware of the facts. Some people are going to interpret that as fear, but we can't help the fact is that the attacks are happening at an all-time high. So it's a tricky one. I think it's a very good question. How do you not do that without raising the alarm bells? Because it's serious.
It is interesting, though. We have raised alarm bells for dozens of years now, but not a lot of people took action based on that. So, in my opinion, when it's existential fear for individuals, we have the fight or flight mechanism, right? Which is why a lot of people appeal to that risk. But when it's not existential, the common result of fear is inaction. People are overwhelmed by all these different bits of news, and they just would rather not talk about it, just walk away from it, which is why I think we haven't seen a lot of progress in actual implementation of OT security. I agree with you, Darren. A lot of times we need to educate people. It's bringing awareness to the consequences, like Catherine was talking about, if we were to not do certain things. However, fear hasn't worked. Like the salesy type, if you don't do X, something will blow up, or something would cause direct action, has not worked. It hasn't worked for climate change. It hasn't worked for COVID response. It hasn't worked for anything in OT security in the past 15 plus years. So my feeling is we need to connect the dots. We need to obviously make more people aware of the negative impacts of not doing certain things, not following certain cyber hygiene, very basic principles of zero trust, like Ray was talking about. So the fear factor, I think, is when we are kind of like using weather as an example, right? So if you don't do X, the immediate blow up will happen. If we can disconnect those things to say, if we continue on this path, right? If you don't invest in OT security, you haven't invested in OT security for 15 plus years, granted nothing happened to you particularly, you, Mr. Company, or you, Mr. Institution, right? Yeah, possibly, right? Or, in general, the power industry or the utilities or the water sector, they're all the examples that we know of in the 10 plus years that have been affected. You are representative of something very similar. So we will recommend you do these 5 things first so that you can avoid at least some level of, exposure, right? So I think that kind of education where you're connecting the bigger theme of others have been suffering because they haven't done these things. So why don't we get started? That would be a good way of kind of conveying the risk, but not at the same time using fear.
What
as a
about
starting
rewards
point.
as well? Why don't we focus on some rewards for the individuals behind it and your cybersecurity teams? That could be a good way too, because I mean they're under a lot of stress, right? I mean the CIOs, we know they're churning 50% a year and would get another job in no time. So I think we need to look after the people that are actually doing it. And now we've got personal liability problems, right? The US government is going after public institutions, CISOs personally. Why would you take a job with that sort of risk? The company needs to provide some basic level of protection for these really smart individuals so then they don't lose their house just because they're going to work every day, right? So these are sorts of things we need to think about too.
So you brought up the people element, and I'm glad that you did, because very often in these conversations, we get pretty far along without talking about the humans that are involved here. So, Catherine, I want to start with you. Blue sky question. Again, if you could design in your own way a program to attract and retain the top talent in OT security, what key elements would you include?
Yeah, I think one of the key elements is to make it very mission driven so that, if someone comes to work today with a purpose, you can teach that person IT, OT, and the information that they need to do the job. But if they're driven by purpose, they're going to have that intrinsic motivation and feel like they add value there. So I think really connecting the impact of what that person does to either mitigating a consequence or helping inform a risk-based decision, but making it, again, like mission driven.
It is interesting, though. Historically, OT has been very much savior focused, as I would call it, where some bright star that's the best in the world that knows both IT and OT technologies and can solve a lot of problems was the person that everybody was chasing. We don't have that many of them, right? So around the world, true blue OT experts are just a handful for every 1,000 that's required. So my feeling is that we have had a focus on superstars for too long, that we now need to bring it down to a more average level, right? So there are a lot of people that do a 9-to-5 job that are fulfilling, that are purpose-driven, like Catherine is saying, but not necessarily superstars, right? Like I wake up, I go to work, and I put in my time, and I'm doing honest, good work, and the company's valuing my results. But in cyber, it was either you are the superstar that everybody wants, or you just don't belong in cyber, right? So we need to bring the average much higher, which I think would only be possible if we start building OT security teams in each company that's just not all OT security, right? So taking people from IT security, traditional ICS, build a team that understands the business and understands what the company is for, right? Both culture and operations wise. And you can always assist them with maybe one OT person or one dedicated OT security person, but overall build from within, I think, is the way to go, because that'll then be sustainable and long-term, overall best value for both the company and the society, because we just can't depend on, the superstar saviors to serve the world. I mean, in terms of disaster recovery, for example, of all the people that have DRP and retainer, if 10 companies in the same area go down, like I would love to see, who gets priority, right?
Yeah,
it's just not practical to have so many depend on just a few.
And Vivek, I think you're right on the diversity of thought there, because if you have people that come from different backgrounds, I've seen library science, I've seen teachers, nurses, also IT and OT, they see the problem differently. So you come up with probably a richer solution if you have people that are all seeing different angles of the problem.
Completely agree with that. And I think adding on to it, we need to incentivize private companies more, that they aren't just all about the bottom line. Because one of the first things that's cut is, well, what is this department actually doing? Cybersecurity itself isn't well educated in terms, isn't well populated or served inside of an organization. to the point that you're
Mhm.
starting to make it so that CISOs can be attacked personally, financially, if there's a problem in a utility. Why is that the case? Why is it that it isn't a mandate by the board in order to
Well,
say,
that's a very good point. I was going to bring that up, Ray. I think one of
Yep.
the things that we saw is that we hear a lot that CISOs are not being listened to by the company. It's sort of seen as like on the side of the business as a
Yes.
tactical function more so than being enveloped into the board as part of the organization. Now, you could argue that that's the fault of IT as well, because they're not traditionally able to communicate very well what they're doing to the business too, but also by the board, right? By the board not caring what they do. So I think there's a little bit of both where they've got to come together. Just like we bring finance and accounting into an organization and they've got a seat at the board table, and most of the C-level roles are. CISO's not always, right? They're always like, let's not bring them in. And we're now starting to see in federal government, state government even, where they're now getting a seat at the table saying, this is pretty important and we need to take this seriously. And I think it's changing. I just think it's going to take a little bit longer.
So
Yeah,
I'm hearing
go back to the financial impact to the company. That's really the only way you're going to drive this in the current environment, because boards are set up for making money at a private institution, right?
So I'm hearing that kind of an answer to the previous question in here, which is about communicating the value of your investment, and being able to communicate at the board level in a way that they understand, as well as being able to talk about how that function connects to the rest of the organization, not just the business, but the organization writ large, and taking an interest there. And that is only going to happen if you're able to communicate effectively. And then Vivek, from some of the remarks that you made around talent in you as well, Catherine, that under my question was a presumption that you had to attract and that you couldn't cultivate it at home. And the answer might be like, you have the talent. It's just not in security. It's in OT, it's in engineering, it's in control systems. And you're going to cross-train them to be the athletes that they need to be, that are multidisciplinary. So we have some questions. I want to bring them in and I want to fold them in with a couple questions. So this is going to be a jumble of things. First, I wanted to ask you what creative solutions you've seen to balance robust cybersecurity with operational efficiency and operational reliability in energy infrastructure specifically. I really want to focus on that. So creative solutions to put the two together. We have some questions in the chat about protecting obsolete assets and the DMZ. So those are standard and tried and true countermeasures. So bring that into your answer. Are those are necessary? Are they sufficient? Or if they are, or if they're not, how do you balance them with operational efficiency?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like Ray was saying before, if we were to build something from scratch, we would have a different level of, encrypted protocols or authentication or identity, right? However, we have infrastructure that's 20, 30, 40 years old and working just fine in terms of operations, and investing in security means investing much more in upgrades and time taken. So it's just not practical for a lot of ICS personnel to just start ripping and replacing things, right? So the traditional approaches to protecting them has been segmentation and monitoring communication from different zones, right? So that's one of the ways that we've been able to kind of monitor and mitigate certain OT specific risks. And that I think, whether it's creative or not, it's still not across the board utilized, right? It's one of those things where we know they work, but I can't tell you if more than half of the OT practitioners around the world have been able to utilize those things, right? So I think in in practical terms, I don't think we need more creativity. I think we need more discipline. So we've had a lot of known, established, simple structures in place to be able to mitigate OT risk while you're waiting for the next upgrade, while you're implementing certain peripheral and security mechanisms across the board. We have not been disciplined about it. So my feeling is more discipline, just sticking with basics when you're doing things right. If you're onboarding a new person, for example, why don't we not don't give them full access on day one, right? And repeat the same problem that you did 5 years ago. Similarly, if you're adding a new component, or at least this one, put them in a different VLAN, or put them in a different segment on day one, so that you're not adding to the problem. So my personal feeling is we don't need more creativity. We just need to execute on things that were already established in OT specifically.
I like that. I like that. You're like, we don't need more creativity. It's too much creativity. just do the thing that works. And sometimes that, until and unless you've done that, you can't go, let's try something new. So I appreciate that.
And to me, it comes down to resources. If I had unlimited resources, I could upgrade an entire infrastructure. I don't have that ability. So how is it that we're going to take a systemic approach back to Vivek's risk-based approach and mitigate the highest risks first? So segmentation, network segmentation, setting up different DMZs so that only things can communicate to things. And then any gateways are the attack surface, make sure that those are up to date, make sure that those segments can communicate what they need to, where they need to software, to hardware, and do that in the securest manner possible. But it all takes money. And the problem that we have is our infrastructures are not being invested in right now. So it's a balancing act. It really is a difficult problem in terms of we aren't going to turn around, come out of this meeting and say, hey, problem solved. One of the threats up and coming vectors is quantum resistance. And NIST has whitelisted some quantum algorithms that are used both in code signing and in secure communications. They have some issues in secure communications. What are we going to do when those are required in the next, 2030? By 2030, we need to be doing that.
So Ray, let me, I like that you're jumping to the future, and this is always a struggle, right? Do we worry about the devices deployed today? Do we worry about the legacy systems? So to go ahead, let's go backward for a second. How do we adequately address some of the vulnerabilities in legacy control system devices, like sensors and controllers that just have basic security? They don't have authentication and encryption. Like, you get access to that, game over. How do we get? Let's talk about that.
You've got to limit the risk. It can only access certain things, so you can't trust it as much. That's where it comes down to Vivek's risk-based approach. And we are working with companies on a daily basis to go through and understand this problem, because this doesn't just sit in the energy sector. It sits in every public utility. It sits in every factory that's manufacturing things. Same problems. If I could get in and get a foreign-made like STM32 microprocessor, if I could start at that level, that infiltrates the supply chain all the way back up. How is it that you can create a set of security that works today that allows you to do this? So you got to start implementing new processes as you start to reach out and replace things as they fail in the field, and then limit exposure by a risk analysis on that sensor that doesn't have any protocol that requires security.
Okay. Let me come to, thank you, Ray. That's, I think, a very thoughtful answer. Let me come to the rest of you and ask a question a bit about the future now. And this is meant to be both a fun and provocative question, because we are laboring under some of the challenges that these devices were designed without security in mind. And sometimes I think that we're from the future. We know what's going to happen, right? We know what's going to happen. There's going to be some new tech. It's going to come out there. And then years later, we're going to be like, oh my gosh, that's not secure at all. So today we are looking ahead. We see some technology over the horizon like quantum. And there's some a question about this as well, but I want to ask, if you were to completely reimagine OT security, so we have quantum coming in the future, and then you also have devices that are designed without security in mind at the controller level. So if we were to completely reimagine OT security in the energy sector from the ground up, ignoring all the current practices and technologies, what might that look like? And most importantly, what current assumptions might we challenge? And I'm going to give you one to start. And Ray, this is directly to something you talked about, that trust is a human notion and cannot be put on machines and networks. Trust is transitive between humans, but not between devices and within networks. So there is an example of something that I would say, hey, that's an assumption that we have that is in here. We've figured it out too late. Zero trust. Well, too late. We've already trusted a bunch of things. So what do we need to really be reimagining as we think about the energy sector and as we talk about where the consequences are unimpeachable and safety is always at stake?
I'll jump in for this one to start off. So trust is something that I think you bolt on later as you look at your architecture and decide what zones and devices you might trust. So if we reimagine security and we're looking at how do we make critical infrastructure more resilient and robust as we're adding more of digital native technologies, I think it's build it in at the start, and that would be at the engineering control level. So how can we actually take engineering and engineer out risk so that we might not even need things like a DMZ if we've already addressed some of that risk at the engineering phase, and then we add in additional cybersecurity controls on top of that. So you have that combination together.
I agree with you, Catherine, but from a different perspective, we should stop chasing vulnerabilities. It has not worked well in IT. It has certainly not worked in OT and will not work in the future as well, right? So if you start there to say, okay, I need to build a system that's resilient, that has low impact if something were to happen, if one device goes down, I should still be able to operate. These are key engineering decisions, right? So if we are making policy decisions, investment decisions, technology decisions, purchase decisions based on other factors, right? I need to continue to operate even if I'm able to, lose one or two, right? Like the Netflix and Chaos Monkey theory where, a bunch of systems can go down, but still the user experience is continued, right? Similarly, if operations continue because of zero trust, because of, layers of defenses, if there are impact analysis and the outcome is low. So if those are the starting points, if we design new systems, then we will not be chasing vulnerabilities, right? Like a couple of years ago, Log4j came out, and literally the whole IT security community globally did not sleep for a week over Christmas to New Year's, right? Now that would be a million times worse if we were to be chasing down vulnerabilities in OT. So we can't do that, right? We can't get there. And so we've had experience to learn from IT security what doesn't work, which is chasing vulnerabilities. So we need to rethink, reimagine OT security with zero trust principles like we talked about.
So
like
how do you do that in practicality? Because if I have code or I have something, it's vulnerable. I may not
necessarily. I mean, you might have a vulnerability that's a score of a 10 to you, but within my own system, it might be a 2. So I could just leave it.
But I mean, isn't this come back to having adequate monitoring solutions in place as well? I mean, you've got one of our principles that we talk a lot about is the world is always thought of, and it's a logical thing to think, that the attackers are coming towards you. We'll just stand there and we'll shoot them as they come towards you, right? It's a defensive-based military scenario, right? But no one's thinking about the data exfiltration component, the back door. Everyone's so focused on the front door. And look, we've seen all these. Look at the Change attack as a good example in healthcare. They were sitting there for 9 days inside the organization doing all the reconnaissance, and taking all the data out the back. No one even noticed. So I think we need to think about a lot of things, and we need to be looking at stuff we've never thought of before. And I come from a drug development background, and when we think about drug targeting, we just don't think of one way to kill an organism. We think of lots of different ways, right? We're targeting it at the superficial level, or the outside barrier, the mitochondria inside. Cybersecurity is no different. We need to be talking about the entry points, the exit points, and all the stuff in between. So I think that's a way I would consider developing new solutions.
Darren, I really like that. You're anticipating a question I was thinking, which is, how do we draw from other fields that have this same problem? We're not unique. Sometimes we're, I think, a little too much like cybersecurity is unlike anything else. It's like, no, it's not. Like there's a challenge. There's lots of ways to deal that challenge. Sometimes when you go after that challenge, the challenge evolves in response, like a virus. So tell us more about that. Tell us more about approaching something, not just from multiple standpoints, but how do you communicate that? And is there a question sometimes, like we were just talking about, we get in cybersecurity, well, is that going to work? How much is that going to cost? Are you going to do option A, B, or C? And you're like, why option A, B, or C? You have to do all of them. How did that get to that place, right? No, in drug development, we would say, well, let's just try this one way of going after the virus. You'd be like, you want to kill the thing, right? You want to get rid of it? Yes? Yep. Okay, then all the ways. So help us understand how they got there, or more importantly, what do we need to do differently in addition to thinking differently? Do we need to communicate differently? Do we need to connect differently? Do we need to design differently?
Well, it's holistic. Look, the other thing to consider is it's holistic, but it's always changing. That's the other thing. Think about when we've got the flu vaccine is a great example, right? Every year they have to develop a new flu vaccine because the current techniques they've already adapted to. This is what the vectors are like these days that we're dealing with cybersecurity. So we have to evolve. And look at ransomware, where it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago. It was all about encryption, data encryption. They get the whole screen pops up. You got to go pay me in cryptocurrency. That's how it worked. They don't even bother doing that anymore. It's so ineffective, and it's so much research and development to keep on doing a new encryption algorithm. They just bailed on it altogether. And it's now all about, what is the goal? What am I trying to do? I'm trying to make money. How do I make money? Oh, I take all your data and I dump it on my servers, and then I go and ransom it. So this is why we've got to think about, what's the goal of the attacker? Think holistically of all the things, things that Ray has talked about, zero trust. And I think, building in risk, as Vivek said, I think there's a lot of these things, and they're all important. No one more important than the other. Just think about the problem differently.
Holistically as well, we need to be constantly monitoring. So doing things like logging events to SIEM, and then using these generative AI technologies to say, this is normal. Start looking for abnormal things. That way you can predict new problems and detect intrusions as quickly as possible.
Well, this is where AI can help us too a little bit, right?
Well, that's exactly it.
I also would caution against this whole this alert fatigue problem that we see. We see it every day, right? Is where people they're trying to connect so many things to so many different pieces. It becomes completely pointless because you can't consume that amount of data. But AI
let an AI
a little bit, but it's a challenge.
Because there is a normal level of alerting that goes on. And making models that can understand a system and understand normalcy is really important.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we're lucky in OT that anomaly detection is easier, right, compared to IT, right?
That is
we can baseline better. We can detect anomalies better. It is interesting, though, to your point, Manish, about cross-pollinating from other industries and other verticals. We tend to be a lot more myopic in the U.S. because we're all vertical focused. In fact, if you talk to, I have a lot of customers in oil and gas and power. If I use a power term in oil and gas, they'll walk me out of the door. If I use an oil and gas term in healthcare, they'll walk me out of the door. It tends to be slightly different in other countries where they're a lot more unified. For example, if you take Asia, Singapore, or Middle East, for example,
great example.
Australia. countries where, because of geographical isolation and maybe not as big of an infrastructure in place, they tend to be a lot more cohesive. And so even Europe, for example, with their NIS2 regulations, right, they have an end goal in mind. So when they say critical infrastructure, they don't necessarily mean those individual isolated water and power and oil and gas utilities. It's everything in a given economic or location.
Isn't
right?
that a
So
factor of the population density and the maturity as well a little bit? Because
it is,
America's
but
the
it is
great,
to our advantage, right? So
yeah, it's
we
an
can
advantage too.
take advantage of those individual countries or smaller regions that are able to better come up with solutions that are not just myopic and cross-pollinate their ideas, right? So for example, if during a hurricane, if you don't model what would happen to a 911 system being down and ambulances being down, for example, right? So these are, now we're talking about a natural disaster impacting power, impacting communication systems, impacting healthcare. These are all
Yeah, that's a good
interconnected,
point.
interdependent, but historically we've treated all these as independent because in this country anyway, we're so isolated and not every one of them are reporting to the government, right?
Even
So
in
we
IT, I would argue that it does that.
same thing, right?
Even it's so specialized that there's subspecialties in the specialties, and
And
there's
those
a
are important, right? Subspecialties are
right.
important because you get the best in breed in those. But I think we should use examples from other countries where they have been able to cross-pollinate across industries and get better results. So, yeah, I really like cross-pollinating. I mean, your example of doing something similar to in drugs for power, for cybersecurity is good. But in general, though, like I think the outcome for the society, for the region, if that's the focus, I think we get these ideas, right? Information sharing, analysis centers are the key component, I think. So we're the very least we can do in cybersecurity is to at least connect all the ISACs together. So we're not reinventing the wheel in one industry for a problem that was already solved in another industry 5 years ago. Right? Or develop something together because it's the same problem that we're effectively trying to come up with solutions for. So yeah, my thinking is we need more communication and collaboration, not less.
So I like the way you're setting that in context for us, Vivek, about you're bringing some nuance, about the global perspective, about using the dialects of different industries. So along those lines, let's talk about, there's a question and it's a dialect that is a particularly challenged one, nuclear energy. So there's the obvious things around risk profile and consequences and regulatory frameworks, but there's also a whole new level of system complexity and legacy issues. Obviously, the threat landscape, incident response and collaboration. IR is highly centralized in nuclear, and in the electricity and energy sector, there's a lot more public-private collaboration. In nuclear, it's a little bit different. So tell us let me ask a very pointed question here. What is the one thing that you think is most important to shift when we're talking about cybersecurity and OT in the nuclear industry?
Oh, that's interesting. I have worked with nuclear customers before. Obviously, in the US, we have NRC and then we have NERC-CIP. We have two distinct regulatory bodies that are responsible, but we haven't seen a lot of new nuclear, at least in the past 30 years, right? Not in the US anyway. I don't think in that regard, nuclear is a role model because the impact of nuclear waste handling or other situations is very unique to that particular industry, right? Versus something that's much more regionalized or compartmentalized in other aspects of fuel handling in other parts of the power industry. So the common themes, though, is that cybersecurity was always important. Nuclear in that regard is very similar to how, for example, the Middle East countries think about security, right? So you don't have to explain security risks to somebody in the UAE or Israel. They live and breathe through that every day. So for them, power or water or any vertical is just one component of the overall risk. So if there's one thing we can learn from nuclear is that we have seen how discipline and a lot of regulation has worked in our favor in nuclear, but we can get the best bits of those and repurpose for the rest of the infrastructure, if you will. So I don't know if I answered the question directly, but to my, I guess, in my opinion, this is flipping the previous conversations before, right? So here we were talking about leveraging each other's strengths to build something bigger. So here, if we're focusing on what we could do one thing in a particular vertical, it's hard because we haven't seen a lot of development. I mean, now, of course, with SMRs and new nuclear, things would be different going forward. But historically, we haven't seen anything brand new. Like there was no nuclear plant built in the past 30 years in the country, right? So it's hard to take examples out of those that hasn't really grown much here. And then, I think in that regard, we should focus on what worked elsewhere versus, what worked here.
Mm.
I'll pick up on that because nuclear is actually what got me into cybersecurity. So
that's
I was,
pathway. You decided to tell us that now. We're almost at the end of the conversation. Just happen to throw that in.
Yeah. So, more than a decade ago during the nuclear renaissance, I was involved in one of the efforts to actually build one of the reactors in the US. And we were touring the old reactor and facility, and the plant manager said, took us into the control room and said, now what's going to be different in the new build is that this whole control room will be digital, not analog. So we're going to have to think about cybersecurity risk. And I said, ooh, what is that? So that is a field that actually got me into cybersecurity. And I think one of the things we can learn from nuclear that is also relevant to healthcare in a way is that, the nuclear industry has to really understand the ups and downs and the behavior and the baseline of their system. Because, critical operations, you have high risks potentially. And so if something is off, then you can identify something's off. So similar to, let's say, individualized healthcare, and applying that to cybersecurity the same way. If we're approaching cybersecurity where we get really good, say, using zero trust strategy, knowing who's in the environment, what activities are allowed, we have a really strong baseline of what's normal. And so we can identify more quickly what's abnormal. And so I think kind of combining that approach that nuclear has to really knowing the system, looking at, say, AI to get better at pulling all that data in to know what normal looks like in our advanced systems today, that could be something that could help move us forward in terms of how we're approaching cybersecurity.
Well, we are pretty lucky to have someone who just happened to get started in nuclear. That's great. And it's really helpful, I think, too, to understand what it's part of the question we're asking. What can cyber be learning from others, particularly around consequence management and thinking about it more as a hazard, not just as a hazard, but in addition to hazard. Let's try and we got a few minutes left here, so we have a lot of wonderful questions. I'm trying to get to them. I'm going to continue to try and get to them. So we have a question about security, and I'm going to bring them along here. I'll lay them all out so you have time, and then we'll ask you to think about an answer. So first, we have a question about secure by design, which is a great question. Integrating secure by design principles, and they brought up asset obfuscation, granular access control, microsegmentation. So I'm going to put that together a bit. That's a near future secure by design, building things today, and then building things today for far future quantum computing threats and proactive quantum resistance strategies. How do you see that evolving, or what do you think is most important for the energy industry? So let's start with those two. So there's near future, and some people would say far future, some people would say not near future, differentiating between cyber and quantum security.
I'll take a stab at this. My feeling is, I'm in the, quantum probably is in the far future for general practitioners and general applications in that era. But really, this kind of goes back to what Catherine was saying. So these are all tactical things, right? So I think the key thing is to be strategic. So as individual organizations start investing in cybersecurity that correlates with their business operations and financial impact, like Ray was talking about, right? So if you can tie these things, security decisions, to how much it impacts operations and how much it impacts security and safety of the organization, then the decisions will be a lot more logical, right? From an investment standpoint. So then it doesn't really matter if today you're doing it for current encryption standards, and in the future you'll do it with for post quantum. Now, granted, we live in a very fluctuating, socioeconomic and political scenarios. So in 3 years, who knows if the world has to make decisions for post-quantum, at the time. But right now, we don't have our basics right. Like, we literally today are implementing zero security practices in brand new building plants like we did for the past 20 years. Like, if that can be stopped, right? Like, if we can start building some level of security, then we can talk about which level of security is appropriate for the 5-year period or the 15-year period, right?
So let me ask you about secure by design, and then I'd like to come to the rest of you for quick thoughts on secure by design, and then we want to wrap up. Do you think secure by design then is a constructive way to think about constructing those starting today?
I 100% agree. I mean, it's something that it's a systems level thinking like we were talking about before, right? So right now we're all struggling with fixing something that's broken, trying to figure out which Band-Aid is the best fit. So secure by design and secure by default, that's the other key thing, would considerably improve the security posture and defensibility of a lot of our critical infrastructure. So yeah, 100% agree.
What do you think, how do you think the energy sector, this question for us of you, how do you think the energy sector is doing in integrating secure by design? Do you think it's picking it up? Do you think there's going to be friction towards it?
Personally, I don't think there's a lot of friction. I know there's some inertia, right? So we're all moving towards it, but it'll take some time. So right now we're managing by, assessing risk across the board.
Yeah. Let me go to the others real quick to get a thought in here to close out.
Please.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I was going to say, we don't want to have analysis paralysis where we're so focused on quantum and future threats that we forget to stop and do the basics. So like Vivek said, I think that secure by design is a good way to start. But also we have to think about making sure that we have the resources, as Ray mentioned before, to really devote to secure by design.
Great. Well, I want to make sure that we end this on time. I want to thank all of you for a genuinely robust discussion. It's what I promised, and I hope it's what we delivered. I hope that you learned something too. And for those of you who were there with us, thank you for your questions. Thank you for your participation. I hope I did okay in bringing your questions into the conversation here. And most importantly, thank you to Key Factor and to IIoT World for hosting this. Enjoy the next session and the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys.